Charles Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a 16-year-old Kathleen Maddox, a troubled and alcoholic teenager. Manson's early years were marked by neglect, instability, and abuse. His mother served time in prison, and Manson spent part of his childhood in foster homes and reform schools. And by the age of 13, Manson had already committed various petty crimes. Over the next 2 decades, he was in and out of prison for offenses including auto theft, forgery, and pimping. Despite being uneducated and marginalized, Manson was highly manipulative and charismatic, traits that would later help him form his own cult-like following. The 1960s were a time of major social upheaval in America. The counterculture movement rejected mainstream values, embracing free love, psychedelic drugs, communal living, and spiritual exploration. This environment created fertile ground for charismatic leaders like Charles Manson, who could prey on vulnerable, idealistic youth. In 1967, the quote, Summer of Love brought thousands of young people to California. Manson, who was recently released from prison, moved to San Francisco and then to Los Angeles, preaching a blend of fringe philosophies, quasi-spiritual teachings, and apocalyptic predictions. He combined elements of Scientology, the Beatles' music, Eastern philosophy, and his own delusions into a disturbing personal ideology. Charles Manson gradually attracted a group of followers, mostly young women, who became known as the Manson family. Key members included Susan Atkins, Patricia Kernwinkle, Leslie Van Houten, and Tex Watson, among others. These followers viewed Manson as a messiah figure and called him Charlie. The family settled at Spahn Ranch, a former movie set in the California desert, where they lived communally. Manson exercised control over the group through psychological manipulation, drugs, especially LSD, sleep deprivation, and quote programming sessions that reinforced his worldview. He preached a coming race war, which he called Helter Skelter, a term he took from the Beatles song on the White Album. Manson interpreted the lyrics as prophetic and believed that the Beatles were sending him coded messages. He convinced his followers that a race war would erupt between black and white Americans, and that the family would emerge afterward to rule over the survivors. In the summer of 1969, Manson became increasingly frustrated by his failed attempts to secure a music career. He had connections with music industry figures, most notably Terry Melcher, a producer and son of actress Doris Day, but his hopes were dashed when Melcher refused to record him. Manson believed that violence would ignite the race war that he had predicted and elevate him to a godlike status, so he instructed his followers to commit murders that would appear racially motivated, to frame black Americans, and to accelerate the chaos. On August 8, 1969, Manson ordered Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Kernwinkle, and Linda Kasabian to go to a house in Benedict Canyon that had once been rented by Terry Melcher. Manson did not have a grudge against the current residents, but symbolically targeted the location. Inside the house that night were actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant and married to director Roman Polanski, her friends Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Warwick Frykowski, and Stephen Parent, a visitor who was leaving as the killers arrived. The murderers brutally killed all 5 victims, using knives and guns. Tate was stabbed 16 times. The word pig was written in her blood on the front door. The savagery of the killings shocked the nation. The next night, Manson led another group, including Van Houten, Kernwinkle, and Watson, to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in Los Feliz. This time, Manson participated briefly but left before the killings began. The couple were tied up and murdered in gruesome fashion. The words "Rise," "Death to Pigs," and "Helter Skelter," which was misspelled, were scrawled on the walls and a refrigerator in blood. The Los Angeles Police Department initially failed to connect the murders. It wasn't until October 1969, after a raid on Spahn Ranch, originally for car theft, and a tip from Susan Atkins, who had talked about the killings while in jail, that detectives pieced the events together. Manson and several family members were arrested and charged with the Tate LaBianca murders. The case against them was built largely on Atkins' grand jury testimony, and later Linda Kasabian's cooperation as a key witness. The Manson family trial began in June 1970 and lasted more than 9 months. It became a media circus. Manson carved an X onto his forehead, later reshaped into a swastika, and his followers protested outside the courthouse, mimicking his gestures and chanting. Prosecutor argued that Manson was the mastermind behind the crimes, controlling his followers with cult-like influence. Though he did not personally kill the victims, he was convicted of first-degree murder for orchestrating the crimes. In January of 1971, Manson, Atkins, Kernwinkel, and Van Houten were found guilty and all sentenced to death. Then the death sentences were commuted to life in prison in 1972 when California briefly abolished the death penalty. Tex Watson was tried separately and also sentenced to life in prison. Charles Manson spent the rest of his life in various California prisons, including San Quentin, Folsom, and Corcoran. He became a pop culture figure, the embodiment of evil in the American imagination. He gave interviews where he often spoke in riddles or incoherent philosophical ramblings. Manson died on November 19th of 2017 at the age of 83 from natural causes. Most of his followers remain in prison. Susan Atkins died of brain cancer in 2009. Leslie Van Houten was granted parole multiple times but only released in 2023 after decades of denial. Patricia Kernwinkel and Tex Watson remain incarcerated. Manson's ideology was an incoherent mix of pseudo-religion, white supremacy, race war prophecy, and pop culture references. Central to his worldview was Helter Skelter, which he claimed would be a global revolution triggered by racial violence. He also considered himself a Christ-like figure, comparing his planned sacrifice to Jesus. However, Manson's beliefs were fluid and opportunistic, often tailored to manipulate followers or to justify his actions. He used LSD and sex rituals to break down followers' identities and replace them with his own dogma. His control extended so deeply that members were willing to kill for him without hesitation or any remorse. The Manson family murders were a defining moment in American history. They symbolized the dark side of the 1960s counterculture, shattering the idealism of the hippie movement. The media portrayed the family as a cautionary tale about cults, drugs, and youth gone astray. The story inspired countless books, films, documentaries, and academic studies. A book entitled Helter Skelter became the best-selling true crime book of all time. Pop culture depictions range from Roman Polanski's grief, he lost his wife Sharon Tate, to fictionalized portrayals in the films like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where Quentin Tarantino reimagines the events with a different ending. Manson's image, wild-eyed, swastika forehead, and ranting, became an icon of evil. He inspired fascination in music, art, and fringe movements, though often in a critical or horrified tone. Charles Manson never physically committed the murders that made him infamous, yet his influence was so powerful that others killed at his command. His story is not just about one man, but about a cultural moment when idealism collided with violence, and when the promise of peace gave way to unspeakable horror. The Manson family cult remains one of the most chilling chapters in modern American history, a stark reminder of how charisma, ideology, and manipulation can lead ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil.